Hello, congregation, family, and friends. I pray all is well with you. Today, welcome to this current edition of Bible Talk. This is our first Bible Talk of 2018. I pray that your New Year's was a blessed one. Tonight, we're going to be starting a new chapter in the Bible, and we're going to be in the book of 2 Kings, and we're going to be using chapter 5 as our outline for what we're doing. 2 Kings chapter 5. We are going to meet some very interesting characters in this chapter. We are going to meet people like Naaman, Syrian. We're going to meet Ben-Hadad. We're going to meet Elisha, the prophet. And we're going to meet a servant by the name of Gehazi. This in addition to a few other characters that show up in this particular chapter. Now, you may have heard this chapter taught before. You may have heard it preached on. I certainly have from time to time. But the Lord really laid it on my heart a few days ago when we were starting up Bible Talk for a new year to really dig in to this chapter. So as a way of preface to all of this, let me just say this. In our passage of Scripture in 2 Kings 5, we are going to see two sins, primarily, pride and greed. Now, these are two of the most serious sins that we can commit. Do you know why? Because they blind us from the love and the mercy of God. And as we examine this portion of Scripture, we're going to find God at work in the lives of His people. What we'll see as we go through it is He's going to bring salvation to one and judgment upon another. Because God is a God of judgment. Yes, He's a God of forgiveness. He's a God of love, but He's also a God of law and order, and He's a God of judgment too. So we need to remember that God knows our hearts. He knows our thoughts. He knows everything that we're doing. He sees everything that we're doing. We can't escape Him in anything that we do, and especially anything that we think. God is there already. He knows also those who are truly His. So as I said, we're going to be introduced to several characters here, and my goal for tonight is to get through the first 7 verses, which is really the beginning setting of what's going to happen here. We're going to see a miracle happen. We're going to see judgment happen. And I believe you'll be enlightened. I hope you learned something from it or maybe convicted. Good evening to all who are with me tonight. I'm glad you could be here for Bible Talk. Now, here's the goal. The goal is to examine in some detail in this chapter how God interacts with all of these people. And I want you to pay attention as we go through this, how God is constantly in the midst of all of these people. What I also hope to show you is how lives can be changed by being obedient to the living and everlasting God. Obedience ultimately is what God wants from us. He wants us to be obedient to Him and be in fellowship with Him. So having said all of that, let's begin reading, because first we're going to be introduced to a man called Naaman. In 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1, we read these words. And just before I start, I will be using the King James Version, and also I have the New American Standard Version here. They happen to be my two favorite versions that I believe are most trustworthy. And sometimes I may revert back and forth because some of the language may be a little more archaic, and I want to make sure that we can understand exactly what God is telling us. So having said that, 2 Kings chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, says this from the King James. Now Naaman, captain of the host or the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. There's a lot going on in that verse. The New American Standard basically replaces the word honorable with the words highly respected. But I think we can get a picture here of what's happening here. Naaman was a mighty warrior for the Syrian army. And while here's what we have to understand. He was captain of the army of the king of Syria. That's a really important position. In the eyes of man, he was a great man with his master, it says, which would be the king, and honorable. Why was he honorable? Because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was highly respected. He was a mighty man of valor, but in God's eyes, now watch this, in God's eyes, he was a leper. Now, this is not just talking spiritually. Naaman had leprosy. And I'm sure you know what leprosy is. That I think it's not quite extinct in the world today. Leprosy is a terrible skin disease. And what happens is it starts rotting some of the extremities where actually body parts can fall off. It's a terrible, terrible disease, leprosy. Well, this man, Naaman, has leprosy. And it's interesting. And now remember, and I always say this, God never puts anything in the Bible that he doesn't mean to say. Every word was given through these men who wrote the Bible by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So there's never anything that God ever puts in the Bible that we should just gloss over or forget about, no matter how insignificant it is. Notice here in the first verse, Naaman is having all of these accolades. Look, he's the captain of the army of Syria. He's a great man with the king. He was honorable. He was a mighty man of valor. All of these things, in the eyes of man, they're all great things. But God says he was a leper. Physically, he was a leper. And spiritually, he was one also, because he was an unbeliever. He was alienated from God's people. So a little bit of history for those of you who know about the Old Testament. And even today, lepers, you've heard of the phrase leper colony. Lepers have always been isolated from society because it is contagious. If you read the Old Testament, whenever someone had leprosy, they were put outside the camp, outside the town, outside the village, and they weren't allowed back in until the priest had pronounced them clean. So it is interesting that here Naaman is the captain of the army, but he has leprosy. So here's what God is trying to show us here. Naaman is a picture of all of those who are isolated from God. When God had given deliverance unto Syria, there was a greater lesson to be learned. Naaman's high position only enhanced the importance of the events that are about to occur. So remember, God doesn't put anything in here by mistake. We have to get the picture of what we have. This mighty man of valor, this man who is honorable, who is lifted up among his own people and even the king of Syria. But God says he is a leper. Now, it's interesting, in case you're wondering if this is a true story or not, Jesus himself mentions this very event in Luke chapter 4, verse 27. Here's what our Lord said. And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, saving Naaman the Syrian. So even Jesus himself made acknowledgement to this very chapter that we're talking about. There are many lepers. There were many lepers. Not all of them were healed. But God has a special thing that's going to happen to Naaman in this chapter. Now, there's two ways to pronounce Naaman. You hear me saying Naaman, but it's also pronounced Naaman. So however you pronounce it, I don't know that that's a huge deal. Naaman or Naaman. The bottom line is, what is he like as a character? Because he's coming into the picture now as an unsaved person. He's also has an illness that should be isolating him from everywhere. Let's see what happens as we move along in our story. In verse 2, it says, and the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. In the New American Standard, it basically says the Arameans or the Syrians had gone out in bands, had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She was a servant girl. Now you'll notice that's the next person we meet. We don't know what her name is. She's unnamed. But her capture happened according to God's will. How can I say that? Because of the important part that she plays in this story. It's small. It's coming up in the next couple verses, and then she disappears from the Bible. But she had a purpose in God's plan. This really is an example with her of God's providence. Remember Joseph? Joseph, after his brothers had sold him, he was put into Potiphar's house, wasn't he? To run the house. Do you remember? It furthered God's purpose while Potiphar's wife, remember, had accused Joseph of attacking her. He was thrown into prison. Then he went through the baker and so on. And they were coming out of the prison and Joseph was left there. But look what happened at the end of Joseph's life. It was all for God's purpose. We don't always understand why God does what he does. The key is that we have to accept it by faith and keep our eyes focused on God. So here we have this servant girl who came from Israel. She is in Syria. She's in a foreign country, and she just happens to be in the house of Naaman. Okay? Not a coincidence. There is no such thing as coincidence. Everything happens according to God's will. So the same way that we saw Joseph placed in Potiphar's house, as I was saying, we now see this servant girl placed in Naaman's house to help achieve God's greater purpose. Now watch what happens. She is aware, obviously, that her master or her lord, Naaman, has leprosy. Look what she says in verse 3. She says, "And she said unto her mistress," that would be Naaman's wife, "Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy." That's the King James New American Standard says, she said to her mistress, "I wish that my master," meaning Naaman, "were with the prophet who is in Samaria, then he would cure him of his leprosy." Just like Joseph, as I was just saying, this unnamed servant girl believed in the God of Israel and in the prophets that God sent among his people. Her heart is with God. We can almost read her thoughts. There's a living God in Israel. There's a prophet in Israel, and God can heal. If only my master, Naaman, was there, he could be healed of his leprosy. What great faith this young girl had, even being in a foreign country and being a servant girl in a Syrian's household. She still had faith in the God of Israel. Her faith is encouraging to me personally. She's in a heathen land, serving in a heathen household, and yet she still looks to Almighty God to help her own master out. In her mind and in her heart, God is my Lord. If you'll notice what she said here. She said to her mistress, "I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy." And the King James says, "Would God my Lord were with the prophet." God. She believed in the God of Israel. So now there's an interesting idea, because here we have Naaman with leprosy, which there is not a cure for. And so he's in a bad way. And then the servant girl says to Naaman's wife, if my master, your husband, was only with this prophet in Samaria, he could be cured of his leprosy. Oh, there's an idea, right? Watch what happens. Verse 4. "And one went in and told him his Lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel." Naaman basically went in and he told his master, which was the king of Syria, saying, "Thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel." Naaman goes in to the king of Syria. He reports the servant girl's words to him, who at that time, as I said at the beginning, was Ben-Hadad. He was the king of Syria. Kind of a strange name, Ben-Hadad. How do I know that? Because we read about him in 2 Kings chapter 8. Verse 7, it says, "And Elisha came to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, was sick. And it was told him, saying, The man of God is come hither." So this king, who was about to send Naaman to see this prophet, would later have an encounter with the prophet himself. So we have verification here that the king that we're talking about is Ben-Hadad. So now Naaman goes into the king and he says, "This is what the servant girl says. There may be somebody that can heal me." And so watch what happens. Verse 5, I'm sorry. "And the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 pieces of gold and 10 changes of raiment." The New King James says, "Therefore the king said, Go now, I will send a letter to the king of Israel. He," meaning Naaman, "departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothes." That sounds kind of odd, doesn't it? Why would he? It's kind of a hodgepodge collection of things. Why would he do that? Here's the point. The king of Syria sent a letter to the king of Israel, which is about to put the king of Israel in a real dilemma. Because, and you'll see that in a couple of verses when we get to it. But at this point in time, you need to understand that there was a truce that now existed between Israel and between Syria. And so we notice that Naaman departs with silver and gold and raiment. And as I said before, this seemingly small detail Why would he have 10 changes of clothes? Why would he have a certain amount of gold and a certain amount of silver? What's the point? It seems like an insignificant little detail, but as I said, nothing is put in the Bible by mistake or by any kind of chance or just because God felt like it. Everything has a reason that it's in the Bible, and we can't overlook even the smallest detail. So while this tiny little detail of 10 changes of clothes seems to mean nothing, it will play a very big part later on in this chapter. If you read ahead, we're certainly not going to get to all of the chapter tonight. If you read ahead, you'll see how all of this fits in. And I would encourage you to do that. I mean, there's only so much we can cover in these Bible talks, and I try to keep them to 30 minutes so that it's reasonable. So we're not here for hours going over this. I don't think that's fair to you or who wants to look at me for an hour or so. But 30 minutes we can do, right? Okay, so here's the situation. Let's move on. Verse 6. Now, remember, Naaman has the letter from his king that he's going to take to the king of Israel. It says here in verse 6, and he, Naaman, brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. Verse 6 of the New American Standard says, he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, and now as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. This is the letter that the king of Israel receives. Can you imagine receiving something like that? Here is Naaman, a captain in the army of Syria. Your two countries are currently under a truce. But what the king of Syria is saying is, I'm sending him to you so that you can heal him of leprosy. You're starting to see the dilemma that the king is going to be in. Naaman presents the letter to the king of Israel, and most likely this is probably Jehoram. We read about him, if you're making notes, in 2 Kings 3 verse 1. So Jehoram more than likely is the king of Israel at this point. The king of Syria wants Naaman to be healed because his leprosy was preventing the captain of the army from achieving further victories and continuing in his work. I mean, if he keeps having leprosy, eventually he would die. And eventually he would get sicker and weaker and he would die. He would be of no use if he's sick. He's the captain of the army. The king of Syria needs him healthy. And because of what this servant girl said, go see the prophet, one king writes to another. And so you can imagine the king of Israel opening this letter and reading it. And there's a situation. What does he do? The king of Israel is not a healer. He's not a prophet. He's not God. What is he going to do? Well, this is where we get into the first dilemma of this entire chapter, because now the king of Israel has been kind of pushed into a corner. And watch what his reaction is in verse 7. And it came to pass, when the king of Israel had read the letter, that's the letter we just got done hearing about, that he rent his clothes, he tore his clothes, and he said, am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man does send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. That's a lot of language here, so let me read that to you in the New American Standard. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes, and he said, am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me. Can you see the king's dilemma? Why did King Jehoram tear his clothes? He was frightened. He was scared that Syria was trying to seek a quarrel against him. That is his reasoning. Do you see that here? He's looking at the situation in a panicked state. The current truce between Israel and Syria could be broken over this. There could be war again over this if he can't get Naaman healed. Because the king of Syria is expecting his captain to come back healed. And so here is Naaman in front of the king. And here he is waiting to be healed. Jehoram says this. He says, am I God, to kill and to make alive? I'm not God. If he can't heal Naaman somehow, some way, then Syria may start a war against Israel. Have you ever had a situation where you were in and you said, I'm not God. I can't make life and death decisions. I can't do things. Only God can do certain things. That's the position that this King Jehoram was put in. He's saying, wait a minute. You're asking me something in this letter that's impossible. I am not God. I can't create life. I can't do that. I'm not God. Why would he think that I could even do this? He's in a panic state. No one could cure leprosy. So King Jehoram sees himself. He's basically in a no-win situation, isn't he? Can we understand his feelings? Can you understand the situation that he was in? But here's another question we have to ask. Where was his trust in the living God? Where was his trust? I mean, honestly, aren't we like that sometimes? Once in a while, we may get ourselves in a situation where we just can't see a way out. We're in what's called a no-win situation. No matter which way we go, it's not going to work out. The problem is, with this king, as he's panicking, instead of turning to the living God, instead of turning to God first, he immediately lets his fear take over. And now he's fearful. He's in a panic state. He's saying, am I God? How is this going to happen if this doesn't get fixed? Syria could have a quarrel with me. They could bring a war against me. What do I do? What do I do? What happens when you're in a situation like that? Do you turn to God first? Or do you go into a panic state? Do you start freaking out? Do you start losing sleep at night? Do you start pacing? Do you start overeating? Whatever you do to compensate for all of that pressure that's on you. Or do you just turn it over to God and let God work things out? We're all guilty of that, aren't we? We're all guilty of that. So now we have a situation where the king is in a real dilemma. What does he do? He can't risk his country going to war, so he's got to figure out something. And I think that what I want to do is leave it here for tonight, because in the very next verse, you know what? We'll do one more verse tonight, because this next section, actually, we see Elisha the prophet enter into the picture. Now that we have this king in this seemingly impossible dilemma, and we have Naaman there who has leprosy, who's looking to be cured. Let's do one more verse, and then we'll finish it for this particular talk. In verse 8, it says, and it was so, when Elisha, the man of God, had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come to me now, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. The New American Standard says, it happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes. He sent word to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Wow. Now we see the prophet Elijah enter the picture. Note that he is called a man of God. He is a man of God. He's a prophet. Elisha is essentially saying here, don't fear that war will erupt because of your inability to heal Naaman. God is going to deliver Naaman. God has a purpose for him. He has a future for him. And he instructs the king to say, let him come now, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Can you see that, unlike the king, who is panicking, Elisha is calm. Elisha's heart is with God. His heart is with God. He's saying, bring him to me. Don't panic, king. You bring him to me, and he's going to know that there is a prophet in Israel. See, that's the difference. Elisha, yes, he was a man of God. He was a prophet. But here's the thing. He was aligned with God. The king was not aligned with God. That's the difference between somebody panicking and not having faith and someone who having complete faith and it perfectly calm. Do you see the difference? Where's your heart at today? Is your heart with God? Is your heart against God? When something comes up in your life, do you panic? Do you freak out? Do you start sweating? Do you start losing sleep? You're popping pills. You're doing whatever you have to do to face the situation. You're pacing the floor. You're tossing and turning at night. Or are you turning it over to God? Are you turning it over to God and saying, hey, God can handle all this. God spoke the universe into being. God made each one of us. He says we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Do you think that God can solve a problem? Do you think that if he made us complete and whole, that if he wanted to heal us, he can heal us? God can do whatever he wants to do, when he wants to do it, how he wants to do it, as often as he wants to do it. Bottom line, he's God. He's Almighty God. And so the difference in faith between King Jehoram, who had little faith because he was panicking, and we have Elisha, the prophet, who is called the man of God. Let's do one more verse because this is getting juicy, isn't it? I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger here, okay? Let's do one more verse. Verse 9. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. He came with his horses and his chariots and he stood at the door of the house of Elisha. Naaman arrives with his entourage. He goes right up to Elisha's house. And it's a bold move if you think about it for someone with leprosy. Remember, lepers were supposed to be isolated. He's supposed to not be around people. But he comes up to Elisha's door. And traditionally, a leprous person would not have been out and about in society. But remember, God is in control of this whole situation. We're going to see a miracle. We're going to see a healing, but we're also going to see judgment brought too as we get further into the chapter. So I am going to leave you here. Of course, you can read the chapter and see how it all turns out. But I'm going to leave it right here. So now we have Naaman the Syrian, the captain of the Syrian army, standing at the door of Elisha, the prophet, the man of God, because Elisha said, bring him to me and I'll show him that there's a prophet. What's going to happen next? Classic cliffhanger, right? What is going to happen next? I encourage you to be back with us next time for the next Bible talk. We're going to continue looking at this chapter. If you want to go ahead and read ahead, it's 30 verses or something? It was a bold and desperate move. Yes, that's what it was. And we're going to still have a lot more conflict. It's not going to go down all that easy. Thank you for joining me for this Bible talk, the first one of 2018. If you have found this to be a blessing, if you've learned something, if you've been convicted, if you know someone that wants to hear this or should be hearing this, please feel free to share it with someone. This has nothing to do with me. I don't want credit, don't need credit. This is the word of God going forward. God has promised that his word would not return void, but it will reach those people that he wants it to reach. So if it has reached you, if you know someone that it needs to be reached, send this video to someone. Post it on your page for someone else to see. I want to thank you for being with me for Bible Talk. Join me next time as we pick up our story of Naaman the Syrian and Elisha the prophet. Thanks for being with me. God bless you.